I'm Lew Stern, and I am Senior Advisor to the Institute of Coaching at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. As well, I am the founder and Executive Director for the Foundation for International Leadership Coaching and President of Stern Consulting. We say that we coaching and coaching professionals and people who use coaching in a professional way are evidence-based. And we say that we collect data, and that data drives our best practices and targets our coaching to the needs of our clients. And yet, when we do assessment and data gathering as coaches, most of the data that we gather, most of the assessment work that we do is very limited. And it's limited by traditional models. Models, to a large extent, that come from clinical backgrounds, individual focus that is around understanding who an individual is versus how that individual is within an organizational context. And not only who they are today, but also thinking about where they've come from, where they're going, and also not approaching it just from a traditional model that is often psychologically driven around who an individual is in their mind, in their body, in their behavior, but also from multidisciplinary approaches, from thinking about data from different perspectives, meaning social perspectives and creative perspectives.
So if I'm tracking and understanding you properly, what you're talking about is an expansion of the field within which you're going to be assessing and collecting data.
Yes.
Beyond what has traditionally been used. Is that right?
Absolutely. In fact, when I mentioned at the conference that we're at for the Institute of Coaching that I was going to be doing a master class on assessment, my close colleague who has 40 years experience said, I thought that I was going to be deadly because my assumption is that you were going to be talking about what instruments you use in your protocol for assessing the individuals that you coach. And when I shared with him that what we're really doing is we're blowing up the limits, the skin that holds in what assessment is, to be a much larger picture, to include so much more. Because when we're coaching an individual that has a past, present, future. We're coaching an individual that has many different roles, many different perspectives. We're coaching an individual within a context of an organization, within a society, within a family. We're coaching an individual who is many more things than a psychological brain. So we need to understand from a coach's perspective, from the coachee's perspective, from a client organization perspective, that there's so much data that we can be gathering that we're missing, that can inform what we do, how we do it, so that we can serve our clients best. And most importantly, that we are not the assessors. So we are also blowing up the model of coach as expert assessor, but rather coach as the guide to help the client and the organization within which they work to gather data about themselves, to come to their own conclusions about themselves. And by learning that, by gaining their own awareness and taking ownership of that they come to their own conclusions about what this means and what they could do differently, what they could add to their repertoire, how they could improve their effectiveness, how they could change the organization. But we are not the ones who are telling them that, and we are not the experts. We are the guides for them to assess themselves.
So it occurs to me that what you're saying is that, in a way, we're applying the emerging principles of coaching, which is to be more of a facilitator than a solution finder, to data gathering an assessment in the same way that we are applying it to the actual interaction with the client.
Absolutely. And the experts that we can be is that when they come to their own conclusions, the questions that we ask and the options that we provide can inform what they do as a result of the conclusions that they draw.
Great. I know that part of this new model that that we're talking about includes drawing from many different disciplines. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, when recently a colleague of mine and I, Doug Riddle from Center for Creative Leadership, conducted research on interviewing coaches who have disciplines outside of psychology, because so many coaches come from psychological disciplines. They come from law, they come from art, they come from music, they come from sociology, anthropology, education, psychology, occupational therapy, speech pathology, you name it. And when we interviewed those coaches about what information they need, the data that they collect to inform what they do with the client, to help that client be as good as they can be, to have the greatest influence and the greatest impact that they can have in their roles as leaders or in whatever role they are professionally. Those disciplines all had very different approaches. So a multidisciplinary approach added to a psychological approach can help all of us as coaches bring so much more to our clients. So as an example, when I asked someone who has a psychological background, has a master's degree, has 25 years experience doing coaching, has taught courses in psychology at a professional school in psychology, but comes originally from a discipline in art. She's a painter. She's a sculptor. And when I asked her, when you sit down with your clients in order to collect data about that client and assess that client to find out what's going on, what do you do? What do you collect? How do you do that? And what would we normally do? Well, we'd give out a test, we'd give out an instrument, we'd do a 360, either a survey or an interview. Maybe if we pushed the envelope, we'd observe them in a meeting, okay? What she did, the first thing that she does, is she sits down with them and she asks them, could you draw me a picture of your organization? And they look a bit aghast, and they say, I can only draw stick figures, I can't draw. She says, that's okay, stick figures are great. Could you draw me some stick figures of people in your organization? And just show me the relationship between them. How close are they? What do they do together? Where are they standing? What are they doing? And they draw these stick figures, and then when they're done, she says, great. Now, could you draw me just a second picture? If this organization was the way that you think it can be, the best that it can be, serving its customers, its constituents, the best way that it could be. And if you as a leader could have influence, and other leaders in this organization could have the influence that they could have, and the people were performing at the optimum level, what picture would you draw? Show me. So she gets these two pictures, and then she asks them simply to describe to her, what do they see as the difference? That's her data gathering. Do you do that? Most of us don't. If I ask an occupational therapist, I interviewed an occupational therapist, and I said, what do you do the first time that you see a client to start assessing what they might need from you as a coach, to coach them to adjust to an accident that they've had? And first of all, they spend this, the occupational said, the first thing that we're taught is that we have to take notes with checklists and check sheets, and they watch every behavior and every eye movement and every angle of the arm and timing everything. And so the level of detail of what they're observing and the assessment of what they're collecting truly informs exactly what they need to focus on in their intervention to help this person to adjust and to be as good as they can be, even how they've been disrupted by their accident.
Right. Okay. In our preparation, we talked about there being 5 different kinds of data or 5 dimensions of data. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through them one by one,
Sure.
and maybe if you could give me a couple of examples.
You bet.
Okay. So the first one is individual, relationship, team, organizational, more of the traditional field that we gather. And can you comment about that?
Yes, we'll break out of the box, okay? The traditional assessment is almost always at least 90% on the individual. When we do a 360, how many questions do we ask about relationships? How many questions do we ask about the team? The teams within which the person is involved, the teams which this person leads, the team which they collaborate with, teams outside the organization, the culture, the system, organizations that serve as their vendors, organizations that serve as their customer organizations. How much data do we collect about how this system, how the process, how the culture operates, how it functions, what are the stated and unstated rules, how do people behave, and what do they control and what they don't control? All of those different elements are so much more than just focusing on giving assessments on personality and interest and style. It's not to say that doing a Myers-Briggs or a personality inventory or any of those powerful tools on emotional intelligence, emotional competence, those are very, very useful, but they're this much of this big a picture.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's see. Recently, in working with a newly appointed leader, coming into a role as the co-director of a division of a financial investment firm. When I was to come in and gather data, yes, I did a full history of the person's life. And I interviewed their spouse, and I interviewed their daughter. They asked me to. They asked me to interview their mother. I interviewed their mother. And I interviewed all of their direct reports. And I interviewed their boss. And I interviewed other senior partners in the firm. And it's all qualitative data, and I got stories and examples. Now, that's a lot of very rich data. But the questions that I asked in those interviews were not all about the individual. Yes, there are lots of questions about the individual leader and their new role and what is expected of them and what are the measures of performance and what do they expect them to do in the first 3 months, the first 90 days. Those are all very important. But we also asked questions, and we tailored these questions. I sat down with this individual, their director of human resources, and the managing partner of the firm. And we talked about what are the questions that we should be asking people, not only about the individual, but about the team they're going to be leading, and about the relationships of the co-director between these two co-directors, this person stepping into this role, and between this person and their family, between this person and the whole organization, how their division will be relating to other divisions, and what are the expectations from those other divisions. And so when we did the interviews for these 360, it became a much bigger data collection process.
Good. Thank you. The second area that we've discussed is timing. And traditionally, I think most of us have collected data at the beginning, and perhaps there's an interim somewhere partway through, and then we kind of review at the end. And I understand that there's a shift in this as well.
Well, there's a shift for me anyway, and certainly many of my colleagues are telling me that they're starting to do more data gathering more frequently. So there's a fallacy. I think we simply need to catch up with what we say. And what we say is that you establish goals at the beginning of coaching, and then you, at the end, most research, if you look at it, is goal attainment scales. And we say, to what degree have we successfully attained the results that we wanted to attain? Well, what happens is, at the very beginning, before you do data gathering, before you start coaching and finding out what they really are willing and able to do, before they start testing these things out and seeing what the organization can handle, before they start trying out new things and seeing what is most successful, and before the organization starts to shape around the individual that you're coaching and the team that you're working with, the goals change. The individual changes, the needs change, the priorities change, the timetable changes. All those things change. And so you can collect some data on the individual, the team, the organization, the relationships. You can do all that right at the beginning when you have your initial meeting with the individual and or their boss or human resource person. But then after you could do the assessment and the 360 and you do feedback and then you have some new goals and you have some new reality. So at that point, you need to start the coaching. You have no idea what's going to work. We all assume that, okay, here are the goals, we're just going to do it. No, we have to feel it out. We improvise. All of us improvise as coaches. And we find out, does this work? Does that work? And based on that, after about 3 months, 6 months, perhaps 9 months, it all depends on how long the intervention is going to be for coaching. If it's an organizational setting or an individual within a startup or working in a community setting, you need to go back and you need to find out what's working, what is the new reality, how is the person adjusting, what skills have they learned, what have they gotten better at, how is the culture shifting, how is the boss reacting, how are the direct reports performing, how are the vendors performing, what is the customer satisfied with now. We need to check that in. And you shouldn't wait till the end of coaching because then there's no chance to self-correct along the way. So we need to do it along the way so that we still have time to include it at the end of the coaching. And then at the end of the coaching, it's really nice to find out whether or not you made a difference. Not only for you as the coach, but for the individual, for the organization, for the team, to celebrate the success and to know what they need to work on moving forward. So then from that, at the end, you can also put together developmental plans for the individual, the team, the organization, relationships moving forward.
Good. The third area is, and I think we've covered a fair amount of this, is the kinds of data that we're collecting. And I think you've described how we're broadening the screen or the field in which we want to do that. What kinds specifically, what new kinds of data are you starting to collect that you didn't used to look at in the past?
Well, traditionally, when someone does what we call assessment, you're using a normative or ipsative scales, you're using instruments, traditional surveys, and through those surveys, the person gets to compare themselves to a database, either on a percentile rank or on a normative scale to know if they are so many standard deviations above or below a norm. Where do they really fit within to other leaders, other people? That's nice, really useful, but there's lots of other methods. For example, structured histories, career patterns, 360s, not only surveys, which are commonly used, but qualitative and quantitative interviews that you gather with people. But also, as an example, gaining more and more use is a significant observation of the individual. We too often rely way heavily on the self-reporting of the individual of what they're doing in their job and how they're performing as a leader and how their teams are responding and how their colleagues are interacting with them and what's going on in the organization. And we rely on the people that we interview for 360 interviews to be telling what really is going on. Well, as coaches, I believe we owe it to the organizations we serve to be an objective observer. And as an objective observer, we actually need to sit and watch and listen and process and then feed back what we've observed from a different perspective. And so that sense of shadow coaching, as Donna Carlin calls it, and strict observation, structured observation, using checklists and check sheets, counting what people do, doing that over time, not only once, but several times over the course. So when we're saying that you're going to do before, in the middle, toward the end, after coaching, follow up maybe a year later after coaching, but you shouldn't just be doing that by doing a 360. You should be doing it by observing what the person is doing. You should be doing it by getting the history of what's happened in the last year. So you're using all these different forms, not only the traditional assessments.
Yeah, what it suggests to me is that what we're beginning to do is to build a lot of flexibility into the use of a broader range of tools. And what I'm thinking as I listen is that in some ways it could be overwhelming to think about all these new methods and all this new information. But what's actually happening, I think, is that the coach is deciding, oh, I need more information about this, perhaps based on an issue that's surfaced in some of the interviewing. I need to know how this individual fits in their community, for example. I need to know. And choosing among a broader range of tools to get that specific information.
Absolutely. And there's, taken as an example, the term selective eclectic is an old psychological term. But what it refers to is there's no best way, no best approach, no best set of data that you collect for everybody. You have to decide, what are you trying to accomplish? Why are you doing this coaching? Who is this individual? What is the context within which they live and work? And based on that, and the history, and what they're used to, and what methods the coach is best at, and what other resources they have available to them, and what the tolerance for data gathering will be, and how it will affect the organization and the context within it work. We don't want to taint that. So we have to tailor, selectively, eclectically, use different methods and different modes, but we don't do everything for everyone by any means. We take 2 or 3 things, we collect them in 2 or 3 ways, we collect them at 2 or 3 times. Every time is different, but we as coaches owe it to our clients to be selective and eclectic with a broad menu from which we choose.
Great. The fourth element that we discussed was the actual how the data is collected. And I think in the last section we covered some of this. We talked about interviewing and dialoguing and talking to other people and shadow coaching. Anything else you want to add about how the collections are done?
The only thing that I would add, I think we've covered all of them. And the only thing that I want to make sure that each coach challenges ourselves to do is that we don't collect data and assess individuals based on what we know and what we're good at. We need to be doing it based on what the client needs and what the best practices are available. And to do that, we often need to bring in other experts and other people from within the organization as a partner to collaborate with us to best serve the client and the client organization.
Okay, great. And the last one, and again, we talked about this a little bit, is the model for coaching. And again, the traditional model, as you said, is really based on a psychological model, a therapeutic model, coach as clinician. And what I understand, or coach as therapist in a way, what I understand the new model to be more is much more multidisciplinary, and coach, the word that occurs to me is facilitator, and I don't know if that's right or not, but more of an overview position in some way.
Well, I wouldn't say it's the new. I think people are starting to think about the fact that if they grew up in a professional discipline, or they learned originally when they went to school, or they learned through doing in a discipline. If they grew up in accounting, if they grew up in art, if they grew up in occupational therapy, if they grew up in psychology, if they grew up in psychotherapy, if they grew up in psychiatry, if they grew up in medicine, if they grew up in law, that their approach using the Socratic method, or using visual modes, or using checklists, or using tests, or using therapeutic interventions and testing them out, that's the way that you have to do assessment and data gathering. And what I think all of us just need to ask ourselves is, how can we draw on all the disciplines that are out there in the coaching world? Because coaching is being used everywhere to change the world. And it's being used by disciplines in all parts of the world, in all different ways, in all different academic and non-academic disciplines. The coaches are coming from very different places, and we need not to be snobs. We need to trust, believe, and respect the value that each one of these disciplines can bring to the data gathering, to the assessment, and to the intervention.